Remember like that flash dust storm we had on Thursday or whatever? What day was it? Is it Wednesday? Thank you. Are you sure? You guys don't know. I was there. No, I was literally there. I was in the backyard of my dwelling place. And I could see the dust rolling in over the west side ridge that I can see from my backyard. And I was, apparently like the Marco Polo app is like an old person app. Is this true? Okay, yeah, so my fellow 40-somethings are like, I love Marco Polo, yeah. So I was Marco Poloing my other 40-year-old friends. I was like, look at that dust storm. Oh my gosh, I'm my father right now. And I was like, look at that. And then all of a sudden, the wind just literally hit me out of nowhere in my own backyard. Like it went from nothing to all of the wind. Was anybody else outside when that happened? Yeah. And then like all the sand in your eyes. I literally, like on my Marco Polo message, I could play it for you, but I didn't send it to the booth or whatever. Like I'm running inside on the message like, oh my gosh, it's sand. As sand does. And so I'm standing there watching, and I got like this huge maple tree in my backyard and watching the things fall. And then my power just goes out. And I'm like, cool, like that happens all the time. And it comes back in 5 minutes. So 5 minutes later, I'm like, the power's not here yet. And then 10 minutes later, I was like, the power's not here yet. Did anybody else lose power? Yeah, okay, that's the thing, like that's right. You look at the outage map and you're like, cool, just me. You're all out. You had power. Good for you. I was in the darkness. Okay. So usually when power goes out, it goes out for a minute or two and you're fine, right? So I left. I went and met some friends at a place, and I came back. And I'm like, obviously the power's going to be back when I get home. And I'm driving up my neighborhood street. I live on the left side of the street. Right side of the street. Bright. Left side of the street. Darkness. Cool. Hours later. And so it's like, okay, obviously it's going to be back. And I look at the Vista outage map because that's what you do. And it's like, cool, just me. Literally just like this little like 2-block radius in the whole city and Michelle's house. But that's what, it was like little dots all over the city of just like, oh, people affected 5, 7, 8. And then like me, it was like 50. And no crews assigned. And I was in the darkness for... Okay, so I go downstairs, right? And you know how you go to Costco and you buy the things you don't need? I bought a Duracell lantern this summer. Thank the Lord had gone ahead of me. And I was like, I'm going to get my lantern out. Because I went camping. Like, I go camping one time a summer, so obviously I need to buy all the things. And I bought the Duracell lantern, and I went to the basement, and I got it out, and I brought it upstairs, and I turned it on, and then I put it in the coat closet and shut the door. Okay, see how like none of you are laughing right now because it's a stupid illustration and it makes no sense? That's the point. Jesus is going to tell a story like that in our passage today that makes no sense. It's completely nonsensical. It's as nonsensical as me getting my lantern, bringing it upstairs, and putting it in the coat closet. I did, and I put it on the kitchen island, and it lit up the whole house. And I was in darkness for 12 hours, by the way. I got power back at 3 a.m., so I'm fine. I had to empty out the fridge, but how long do you trust cheese? Forever? Amen, brother. Not going to say that hasn't bit me in the butt a time or two. Anyway, okay, so today, Matthew chapter 5 is where we're going to be, by the way. We're going to read a familiar passage where Jesus calls us, his followers, and the people he's preaching to more directly in this passage, salt and light. The salt of the earth and the light of the world. And he says something like what I said. He's like, nobody lights a candle. Nobody lights a lamp. And nobody gets a lantern out of the basement and puts it in the coat closet, right? Nobody lights a lamp and puts a blanket over it. And his illustration is nonsensical on purpose. Because everybody knows you don't do that. The point of a lantern is that it is visible, strategically placed, and therefore helpful. And he's saying, we're going to find today, this is how he has created us, his kingdom people, to live in the world. It is nonsensical for a Jesus follower to inhabit the world in a way that is not visible and therefore helpful to the space, the people around them. And I would say that's probably kind of the big idea today. It is nonsensical for a Christian, a kingdom person, a Jesus follower, to inhabit the world in a way that is invisible, that is not helpful to the world around us. Now, 2 quick words here. First, faith today in our culture has become largely an invisible thing, except for bumper stickers, Facebook posts, and politics. Right? Like, faith has become a largely internal endeavor in our world. It is privatized and internalized. It is about what you believe in your heart and what you think. It's about values, morals, and what you believe, right? It's mostly invisible. To be a Christian for many in our culture today means to have the correct opinion on issues of morality, afterlife, doctrine, family values, and so on and so forth. But the point is that it's personal. And so therefore, what has also happened is it feels largely inappropriate for it to make it outside of you in a public setting. And around the supper table, we don't talk about things like this at the supper table. Who says supper? I'm so old. But you know what I mean? We don't talk about these things because the right place for faith in our culture is just in our hearts. It's just for you. I love that for you. But isn't the motto of our church, isn't the vision statement of our church like in the city for the city? That doesn't sound like something invisible to me. And Jesus is saying the same thing. Being a Jesus follower and treating faith like that is like getting a lantern out of the basement in a power outage and putting it in the coat closet. So the question for us is, what does it mean to be salt and light? When Jesus says this to his people that he's giving the kingdom to, what does that mean? And how should we live? And how should we inhabit our lives and our worlds? So let's talk about it. Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20 is where we are today. We are in a series on Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, if you don't know. We have a reading plan that follows along with this. So if you have been reading with us, you can get that right on our website or at the Resource Center on a little piece of paper back there. You would have read these chapters in the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, 7. This is the second part of the intro to one of Jesus' most famous teachings, often called the Sermon on the Mount. So here's what he says. Last week, he's gathered the people around him, and he's reversed the values of the kingdom in the world. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who show mercy, and so on. We talked about that. Now he says to these same people, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So there's our passage. What is he saying? Let's walk back through it, okay? He uses a couple big metaphors right at the beginning. Salt, light, city on a hill. The city on the hill and the light are kind of the same illustration. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill can't be hidden. That's what he says. So they're the same thing there. So the first question for us is like, what does it mean to be salt of the earth? What is salt? People call me salty all the time. And usually their tone does not suggest compliments. What does it mean to be salt? Well, okay, let's go through the list. Okay, salt is a preservative. It stops decay. It's a purifying agent. It's a seasoning. It brings out the flavor. It's lots and scholars are saying hey, there's 11 different possible things that salt could be. So in biblical interpretation, our question is, okay, well, what does Jesus mean? Which one of these things? And we like to pick and choose, and perhaps they're all helpful at certain points. But how do we go, okay, what was he trying to say by this, though? So for just a heads up right now, I'd like to acknowledge my sources here. Jonathan Pennington is a Matthean scholar, Matthean of Matthew, and Tim Mackey from Bible Project. Like, their thinking on this has really helped me kind of put this together. And so a lot of the train of thought and the logic here is from their research this week. So great resources there. But here's what they say. They say, Jonathan Pennington is like, well, okay, Jesus is using salt and light as mutually reinforcing metaphors here. They're in parallel, meaning one is illustrating the other. So, okay, if we want to find out what he means by salt, do we know what he means by light of the world? Is there a more direct connection there where we can kind of discover what he means here? And the answer is yes. Light of the world and sitting on a hill is a much more explicit allusion to their scriptures, the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, we call them, to something that these people in this time would have immediately known. He's making an inside joke. He's quoting a line from The Office or whatever, where they all go, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about Michael Scott, whatever show the kids are watching these days. Okay, that's what he's doing here. So will you turn to Isaiah chapter 2? Isaiah is one of the major prophets in the Old Testament, called a major prophet because he wrote more content than the 12 minor prophets. That's why we just call him major prophet. So Isaiah is going to be a little after halfway, kind of after Psalms and Proverbs. And there's 66 chapters in this. I want you to go to chapter 2. Okay, so Isaiah, if you remember the story of Israel, maybe back from our covenant series a couple weeks ago, or like a month or two ago, we did a series called Threads of Promise, going through the Old Testament narrative through covenants. In Matthew, this series is called To Fulfill What Was Promised. So if you missed that series, I encourage you, go back and watch those 5 or 6 weeks. It kind of gives you a good precursor to leading up to the Gospel of Matthew. So I forgot why I was saying that, but anyway, you should know it anyway. It's good. Okay, Isaiah chapter 2. What does he mean, light of the world, sitting on a hill? And this is, some people call Isaiah the gospel of the Old Testament. Isaiah is prophesying, meaning just giving the word of the Lord to the nation, to the people, in a time when they are apostate, meaning not really following God's ways. Remember Psalm 119 we read in worship time, right? God, your ways give life. Your statutes are good. It's good for the world. In them is light. Like this is kind of the covenant that Israel is called to step into, following God's ways in the world. And it's been hundreds of years since they've received this covenant from the mountain at Mount Sinai from Moses, like after the Exodus. And the nation has just gone so astray. And so Isaiah is telling Israel, God's going to discipline you and take your light away from you, but he will restore it. And this is one of the restorative prophecies, okay? There's enough background. Isaiah chapter 2. This is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Judah would be like the state or the county, Jerusalem, the city in it, okay? In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established. Okay, so Lord's temple on a mountain. Like all the significant things happen on top of the mountain, okay? Jesus is on the mount here, okay? As the highest of the mountains, it will be exalted above the hills, and all nations, the whole world, will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob, just another word for Israel, and he will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, another word for Jerusalem, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between nations and settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Okay, so this is probably the passage that Jesus is alluding to here. These images, the sitting on a hill, the light of the Lord's instruction, the law, which was called Torah in Hebrew, okay, also shorthand for the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament. And let's just look at what this passage is saying. There's this restored good city of Jerusalem, Zion, where the Lord rules from, okay? The good place from which the Lord rules, Jerusalem. And we know it's not that in Isaiah's time. He's saying, you have not done this. You have not followed the Lord's ways. Therefore, you're not a good city bringing light and goodness to the world. But this restored, God will restore it and make it what it was supposed to be. And his temple will be there. And out of it will flow his instruction, his law, his Torah, okay? His statutes, his goodness, like we read about in Psalm 119. And because of that, look at what happens. The nations stream to him for judgment. Not judgment like, oh my gosh, like he's helping set the world right. He will judge between issues and conflicts of nations, and it will bring peace and goodness. How do we know that? Well, because look at what happens as a result of the Lord's instruction going out into the world. Peace, justice, goodness. Swords are turned into plowshares. Plowshare is just the word for the blade on the back of a plow. What's a plow for? Cultivating the land, growing food, bringing life. Okay, so this instrument of war, the resources put into that, the metal is now being used to bring life. That's what happens when God's instruction goes out. Same thing again, right? Something else is spears into pruning hooks, to prune trees, to bring life. This is what justice in the world looks like. And it's God's law that brings this. The instruments of death repurposed to bring life and flourishing as a result of God's good instruction going into the world. And the final sentence is, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Like in light of all of this, let us walk in his light, because isn't this what we want? And isn't this what the world was supposed to be? Isn't this what you want in your life, in the places where you encounter injustice in the world, and where things don't feel like they are the way they should be, and you have this sense in you? Isn't this what you want? And basically the idea here is in this passage, the Hebrew words are rhyming for law and light. So it's wordplay. All it's doing is it's saying the law of the Lord, his instruction, is his light. It's putting those two ideas together. And so that's what we think. And that's what we read again in Psalm 119. And we have this idea in our culture too, like, I have seen the light. Oh, I'm enlightened. A good idea is a light bulb over your head if you're a cartoon. Psalm 119, 105, we didn't read this. Your word, Lord, is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path. So we have these ideas. We have God's Torah, his instruction, his law, his light. And it's his instruction, meaning of the law he gave to Israel. So Torah and covenant he gave to Israel. These ideas are intertwined in the first century mind, in our scriptures, and hopefully in the Christian mind, but we'll learn and we'll step into that, okay? So the ideas here, I think I've said this. The light of God's instruction that he gives to his people means that we inhabit the world in a way that brings peace, justice, and displays God's character and goodness to the nations, to everybody. And that's exactly what God says to Israel when he gives this covenant. We went over this a couple weeks ago, I think in our last series, like the covenant he gives to Israel in Exodus chapter 19. What does he say to Israel? He saves them, redeems them, brings them into his grace and mercy, and then he gives them this law and says, will you be these people in the world? Will you live this way in the world in light of my light? And he says, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, if you are these people, then you, out of all nations, will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And we understand the idea of priesthood, right? The idea of a priest is somebody that is kind of standing in between two different parties to mediate and to represent one to the other and the other to the one. And he says, you who have my instruction, my covenant, my light, you stand in the middle for the people that don't know it yet, that don't have it yet, so that they can have it. That's who you're supposed to be. And then Jesus pulls this back in when he stands and brings the kingdom on the side of a mountain in the boonies. He says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You embody my covenant, God's covenant, by living his ways in the world so that it has an impact and an effect. And in fact, it's nonsensical to not live that way. Or it's nonsensical to live that way. Double negative makes positive. Don't want to go that. Fixed it. So back to salt. In light of this, what does light of the world, city on a hill mean? Okay, and that was the picture in Isaiah, right? The temple is on the hill. Jerusalem is on the hill. You are the city on the hill. You cannot be hidden. Everybody sees it. So what does that mean for salt? Well, we understand what it means maybe more better now in light of seeing, okay, thank you. It's all tied in with this idea of covenant instruction in God's light. His people being his partners in the world that embody this and bring his goodness to bear on their situations. His instruction brings life. And we talked about salt being a preservative, but even more than that, because it could make things endure for so long in the ancient world, salt in the ancient world really does mean life for you. You need it to live. So light of instruction being life for the world, salt being life for the world. Do you see now? Oh, it's all kind of pulling together. And at the heart of this thing is God's covenant, the goodness of his instruction. And all throughout the Old Testament, actually, you have a lot of references to a covenant of salt. Numbers 18 says a covenant of salt. When God is talking to King David, he says, I mean, everlasting covenant of salt. So because salt makes things endure for so long and therefore brings life, the idea of salt in a covenant means a long-lasting, everlasting, enduring promise. So God's covenant is one that is long-lasting and enduring and brings life. So to pull it all together, there it is. What are God's promises? God's promises will endure. They will bring life to the world. And his promises have been that after the fall, after Eden, after Genesis chapter 3, though through people he chooses to work with and partner with in the world, he will bless all nations. We saw that in our last series. Abraham, he comes to Abraham and goes, hey, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. That nation became Israel that he gave the covenant to. And I'm going to bless all of the nations, the whole world. All nations just means everybody, the whole world. I'm going to bless all the families of the earth through you. And how is he going to do that? Well, then he gives them the light of his instruction and says, what we read in Exodus chapter 19, be this in the world. And then we saw that it didn't really happen, but his intent is still to bring all of creation and people back into his place with his presence, dwelling in his goodness, and that the world is good because of that, making the world into a place that doesn't need swords, but plows. We're to bring life to the world, flourishing to the world, because he's brought that to us and then brought us into partnership with him. Our vocation as humans is this. But we know the problem. The problem is that Israel didn't live up to this promise. It's not like they necessarily weren't. Never mind. Israel didn't live up to it. I'm sticking to the script here. It's good for all of us, okay? We know Israel failed in their vocation, and we would too. And Adam and Eve did as well. It's been the story since the beginning. And then we see in Isaiah, not just chapter 2, but Isaiah continues on. And the question with Isaiah, right, it's kind of the culmination of Israel's failure in this covenant is when Isaiah's writing. And Isaiah's going, what are we going to do? We didn't embody this covenant. We didn't bring this light to the world. What is God going to do in light of this? Is he going to abandon us? Is he going to pull the plug? What is going to happen? How do we go back to the covenant series? How do we fix that problem, that perennial problem since Genesis chapter 6 of the thoughts and inclinations of the human heart always being evil all the time? There's something internal that needs to shift and change. And Isaiah starts prophesying about this figure, a servant, somebody on whom the vocation of Israel is going to rest. And he will be the representative. He will live and embody the covenant and bring this light to the world and God's instruction to the world as he walks it out in his life. And what comes with God's instruction and light in the world? Goodness and peace and healing and justice. And then embodied, we get Jesus. And we see that Isaiah was prophesying about this representative messianic figure, messianic, Messiah, anointed. Talk about Jesus, you always get a little misty, right? Because it's so good. This is so cool how God has put all this together. So Jesus, the one who embodies the covenant, embodies the light of God's instruction, right? John chapter 1. When John, the Gospel of John, the fourth book of the New Testament, he's writing about Jesus, it says what? It says, in him was the light of life. All of these themes, like you see them all just getting pulled right together in a person. Not even in some misty abstract idea, in the concreteness of a human being who is the human being that we should have all been, the one who is in partnership with God, walking in his ways, imaging him perfectly, and bringing goodness to the world. And then Jesus shows up. What happens when he just starts living his life? Goodness to the world, healing, demons being driven out, oppression being overturned, the underloved and the overlooked being brought in, transformation in people's lives. Luke chapter 19, when he goes to Zacchaeus, the one who's been exploiting his neighbors as the chief tax collector for years and years, goes to Jesus' house, and Zacchaeus is like, oh my gosh, I've seen the light, pun intended. And what does Zacchaeus do? He pays back everybody that he's wronged. Do you see how the light of God's instruction, embodied in the covenant people and person of Jesus, is bringing this goodness and this righting of the world back? That's what happens. Look at even the small group of the disciples. Let's call them a small group, right? 12 people. Sounds like a small group to me. You got Matthew the tax collector writing this book, by the way, not Isaiah, but Matthew, who is also a traitor to his people. In the same small group, I said this before, as Simon the Zealot, the one who thinks that the kingdom will come through revolutionary violence that overthrows the corrupt authorities in Jerusalem. Okay, so the one in cahoots with the corrupt authorities and the one who wants to literally kill them in the same small group. Okay, but do you see how Jesus at the center of that group is bringing those people together? And I bet you by the end of their time together, the relationship had transformed and changed. You think there was probably forgiveness and healing and mercy and people just getting over their things to follow Jesus. That necessarily meant forgiveness and reconciliation needed to happen. Oh, interesting. Should we think about that? I'm off script. I don't know where I am. Said that. And then he comes to us. And he says, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. With all of these things, like a very dense metaphor, all of these things wrapped up into it. And he says, it's you. So be it. And then he says this funny thing. If salt loses its saltiness, what good is it? Sitting on a hill can't be hidden. Nobody lights a lantern and sets it in the closet. Comically nonsensical things. But that's the point. Salt can't lose its saltiness. Have you ever put salt on something and you're like, oh, this salt went bad? No, salt doesn't go bad. We'll talk chemistry, it's a very stable compound. Whatever. Salt can't be not salt because what makes it salt is the fact that it's salt. It just is. And that's what Jesus is saying. That's what you are. If you're following me, I have remade you into this type of human. And what a human is in God's world is the type of being that is salt, that is light. Because a real human is somebody who's walking in the light of God's instruction, who's living on his breath. That's what it means to be human. And that's what it means to be saved. That's what Jesus is making us into. It's not just, when you die, you go to a good place. No, it's so much bigger than that. You're made into who you are already created to be and who we've forsaken being in the world. That's what sin is. Sin is just you forsaking to live as what you really are, which is human, which is good, which is salt, which is light. It's tragically nonsensical for us not to be the kind of creature that reflects our Father in heaven, follows his good instruction, and therefore brings goodness, peace, justice, light, healing to the world. And he redeems us and recreates us into that again. And we learn to live a new life. We learn to live into that. What does that look like? What does it mean to live like this in the world? And then good for us, he has the whole rest of the Sermon on the Mount to describe that. And we're not going to be preaching that. So after this sermon, when you ask that question, what does it look like to be salt and light? Go read the Sermon on the Mount. That's what it looks like. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So this is why Jesus, though, in the next verses, says, I'm not here to abolish the law, to abolish Torah, to abolish God's instruction that you've known since the beginning. This, what I'm saying right now, is the fulfillment of all of it, because it's the covenant, the light of the covenant that brings God's goodness and life to the world. So just be that. Be salt and light. Be visible, proximate, and therefore helpful and impactful. And then we're like, okay, just be that. Great. How? I don't know, just do it. You are it. Just be it, okay? Let's pray. Thanks for being here this weekend. No. How do we do that? And so that's what you're thinking, right? That's what these people are thinking as they hear Jesus say this. And then he's like, oh, I'll tell you how to do it. It's simple. Just be more righteous than the Pharisees. Okay, it's like saying, be like more cool than Pastor Josh. Good luck, suckers. Sorry, the denim jacket comes out and you get all cocky again, okay, in the fall weather. No, it's covering. But what he's saying, I'm sorry, I'm legitimately sorry. Does anybody else want to finish this? Stop laughing. Stop it. What he's doing is he's saying, oh, just be better than the best people you know at following the law. Because that's who the Pharisees are. They're the people who've made a lifetime career out of following God's law to the exact letter of instruction, because that's how they believe the kingdom is going to come back to bear on the world. Okay, we haven't followed his law. We were first, right? We got disciplined for it. That's what Isaiah is talking about. So we need to follow this law perfectly. Externally, and we get this picture of the Pharisees as kind of these religious zealots, strict religious, external religious adherents to the law. How are we to exceed their righteousness? If righteousness comes by following the letter of the law, how are we to exceed that? And the point is that you can't. So Jesus is saying, if you play their game, you'll always lose. But the point is that they're playing the wrong game. So what's the right game? If they were criticized for strict religious external adherence, it means that we'll see that they're missing the heart and the character of God's instruction. And isn't it interesting? This is really interesting. Think about this, okay, church people. Think about this. Isn't it interesting that you can adhere externally to God's instruction, to all the things you think a good Christian should do, yet it doesn't bring his light and his justice and his goodness and his reconciliation to bear on the world? That's what he's criticizing the Pharisees for, saying you might be following this law, but what's the point of following the light of God's instruction? That it brings goodness to the world, and you're not bringing goodness to the world. You're bringing oppression and heavy loads that you're putting on people. Hey, church people, like the churchy things that we do and the little culture that we fall into and everything, is it putting weight on people, or is it bringing freedom to people? Okay, so how do we figure this out? How does it work? Well, let's talk about Sermon on the Mount for a minute. Just an example from the Sermon on the Mount that comes up after this, when Jesus explains how that works. He says something like, you've heard it said, don't murder. Okay, it's one of the 10 commandments, one of the big 10. Don't murder. But I say to you, whoever is angry with their brother or sister has committed murder. I say to you, anybody who looks at somebody else and goes, you idiot, is subject to the fire of hell. Now, I assume that most of us, and I don't even know all of our stories, most of us in this room probably haven't killed somebody. Okay? Good job. You're following the letter of the law. But how many of us look at others and are like, you're so stupid. You're such an idiot. Has anybody driven recently? But you know what I mean? How quick are we to dismiss other human beings? And isn't that what murder is? To dismiss another human being so much that you say, you're not even worth existing. And to be the one that decides that. How often do we decide that? Just by holding somebody in contempt. You aren't worth the air you breathe. You are so stupid. You're a fool. You're an idiot. You're not worth my time. And Jesus is saying, don't you see they're the same thing? And if we aren't killing people, but we're walking around holding other image-bearing human beings in contempt, thinking they aren't worth the air they breathe, how is that bringing light and goodness and justice to the world? Are we walking in the light of God's instruction? Technically, we're not killing people, but also we're completely missing it. And that's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying it's not internal versus external. Like righteousness is right relationships. If we are walking around in our lives constantly looking down on other people, are we in right relationship with them? No. Even if they never know it, that is affecting the world. Righteousness means right relationships. That you would be at right relationships with other human beings. That human beings would be at right relationships with the earth, with creation. That we as a church and as God's people would be in right relationship with him. Righteousness. This is why Jesus says later, we'll read in Matthew chapter 9, he tells the Pharisees, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. What's kind of the dichotomy he's putting up there? Sacrifice is the letter of the law, right? Torah prescribes sacrifices to the Lord. You're doing all that fine, but you have no mercy in your hearts whatsoever. And you're looking down on everybody else and you're oppressing people by your unmerciful lives in the world. That's what that means. And so we look at this, we go, okay, the Pharisees are all about external things. Well, that's easy for me. I know the Christian thing to do is it's all about the heart, the internal. It's inner versus outer. Have you ever heard this? It's relationship versus religion. I get the impetus behind that. It's fine. It's wonderful. If you have the sticker on your binder or whatever, that's great. But that's also kind of missing it. If it's not just about the external, okay, good. It's also not just about the internal, because I already said in our culture, the internal for us means it's all privatized, and I can be an invisible Christian as long as I believe the right things. But Jesus says that's completely nonsensical. You can't simply push to the opposite direction and have this comfortable, privatized, internalized faith. That's not what we want. That's not salty and lighty. So this passage confronts that mentality too. It's not just inner versus outer. It's not religion versus relationship. It's integrated, transformed, whole persons, redeemed, saved persons, new creations in Christ. Given a new heart, following him, learning to live a new life from the inside to the out. If your inside doesn't make it to the out, then has your inside really changed? And that's what Jesus is going to ask him. Can a good tree bear bad fruit? If you think your inside has really changed, are you really following Jesus? Are you really walking in the light of God's instruction? Has that made it to the out? Are you an invisible Christian? Well, that's nonsensical. There's no such thing. This is the covenant that Jesus is here to fulfill. Jeremiah chapter 31. We went over it a couple weeks ago. Let's read it again. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, says the Lord. I will put my law, the light of my instruction, where? In their hearts, on their minds. And I will be their God. They will be my people, walking in my light in the world, bringing what I desire to the world. And what does Peter write? One of Jesus' best friends, he writes in one of his letters in the New Testament. He says, as Jesus fulfills God's promises and fills his people with his reanimating, recreating, redeeming, empowering spirit, guess what? We are now God's temple. This temple that we looked at in Isaiah chapter 2, on top of the hill, through which God's light and life goes to the nations and to the world. That's you now, says Peter. You are a royal priesthood, he also says. Oh, pull in Exodus chapter 19. Oh my gosh, it's like it all makes sense. All of the metaphors, everything is being pulled together in the person of Christ, and now in us, who he makes us to be in his likeness. So, we are God's temple. We are his salt and light. We follow him and we learn what that looks like in the world in his teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. Please read it if you haven't. We learn what it looks like. We learn it looks like no violent retaliation. We learn that it looks like unconditional forgiveness. All the things that make no sense and completely counterintuitive in the ways of the world. Somebody hits you, you hit them back, maybe a little harder. But then what happens? They hit you back, maybe a little harder. Then it continues to escalate. You see, when Jesus says no violent retaliation, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other cheek, this is what he's saying. He's saying, look at what that brings us. That brings us escalating conflict to the level of nations. We're seeing it in the world right now. What does it look like for us to live in in the light of nonviolent retaliation. Well, not even retaliation, just nonviolence, like no violent retaliation. What does it look like for us to unconditionally forgive people? If you're going to pray the Lord's Prayer on a daily basis, which is coming up right in the next chapter, forgive us, what's the assumption there? As we have forgiven others. But you don't know what they did. No, he does. Doesn't mean it was right, doesn't mean it was good. But if we're going to bring healing and light to the world, the way that a Jesus person walks is they struggle to walk into forgiveness. And it's a struggle. Refusal to hold others in contempt. Refusal not just to sleep with someone else's spouse, but refusal to even let your heart and your mind objectify somebody else for your personal gratification. That's what he's going to talk about. This is what it looks like to live as God's salt and light in the world. Love an enemy. That makes no sense. I can love people that are annoying to me. I can try really hard and feel like such a good Christian to love, like, you know, the annoying lady at the office. Or there's not in my office, obviously. I'm just... But you know what I mean? Like the people, I'm not just talking about the people that are like, oh, she's kind of annoying, but I'm so holy because I love her. No, like, have you really loved an enemy? What does that take? What does that look like? And so on and so forth. And so I don't know if this sounds like a tall order to you. It is. I don't know if it feels overwhelming to you. Oh, go be the change agent in the world, right? It's not even change the world. I think maybe that's unhelpful language. It's impact the world. That's what salt and light does. It impacts the space. Does it change? When I brought my lantern upstairs in my house, did it change my space? In a way, it lit it up, but the space was still there. Like all the things I would run into in the dark were still there. I just now knew how to navigate around them because I could see. So it's impacting the world. That's what it is to be salt and light. And let me just end with this simple observation. If it feels overwhelming to you, if it feels like a lot, do you remember who Jesus is talking to here from our sermon last week? Just a bunch of normies, man. Normal people, if you're not picking up the slang. But like last week, we talked about the Beatitudes, and what does it say? In the end of chapter 4, it says he was going around in kind of the outskirts, and all the lame people, all the people with bodies that don't work, all the people with illnesses, the people with demonic oppression, the people that were in severe poverty, the people that couldn't support themselves, the people that maybe their families had cast them out, the people that are in the slums, the outcasts are gathered to him, and then he tells them, you are blessed because the kingdom is now coming to you. And if the kingdom is coming to you, guess what that means about you? You are now the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. Right? Salt of the earth, regular old people. Regular old, unremarkable us. Like, you guys are super awesome, but also we're just a bunch of normies, man. And that's not a bad thing. We're a bunch of unremarkable, normal, glorious people. Filled with his spirit. We are his salt and light. And again, that's counterintuitive to the way the world works, because who impacts the world in our social economy? The influencers. So much so that it's now a job. Pray that that goes away so fast. We all have a podcast, right? The movers and shakers, the influential people, the people with money to get stuff done, the people with social clout, the people with status and position, the people that have this job, that know these people, that have this connection, that can do this thing. Those are the people that impact and change the world. And then I feel like, what can I do? And the answer is whatever Jesus wants you to do. Simple, old, normal us. Just being true humans, walking in the light of God's instruction, bringing his goodness, his peace, his justice to the world. That's what you are. That's what you're remade to be. And friends, it's nonsensical for a Jesus follower, for a Christian, to inhabit the world in a way that is invisible and unhelpful. It's not who covenant people are. You know, the series is called To Fulfill What Was Promised. Matthew, to fulfill what was promised. And we see how Jesus fulfills all of God's promises. We talked about how everything pulls together in him by standing in the place where we failed, right? By living as a holy priest among us, walking in God's light, bringing the blessing of Abraham through Israel to all nations, to all of us. But it's not just Jesus that is fulfilling what was promised. In him, we are welcomed into this vocation with him to continue to fulfill what God has promised to the world. That his salt and light, that Summit would be a blessing to all nations. That through us, there would be light in Spokane. And in him, as his body, we are now God's temple, his sitting on a hill, out of which flows the light of his instruction, that is his life-bringing impact on those around us. And that's what it means to be salt and light. So may we be these people. Will you stand with me? And I'm going to send us out in a benediction, which is just going to be that. Benediction is just a sending prayer, just us realizing that what happens with the church community is not just the gathering on a Sunday, but it's the salty and lighty lives that we live out in the world. So may we be women, men, children, families, co-workers, brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers, who are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. May Jesus shine through us this week.
So glad that you joined us today. We hope that you have been filled up, challenged, encouraged by what you heard. Our desire for you is that this resource be used in conjunction with you belonging to a local church so that you can grow in the context of community. Following Jesus isn't something that we're meant to do alone. So if something from worship or the message was stirred up inside you today as you listened, we encourage you to bring others into that. Tell the story of what God is speaking to you and what he's leading you to. If you're in the Spokane area, we would love for you to join us in person for services. If you have questions or you need prayer, you can fill out a Connect card on our website and a member from our team will reach out to you. You'll also see opportunities there to join a community group, to get baptized, or to get involved by serving with us. If you're not local, we encourage you to get connected with a church that's near you so that you can follow Jesus with others and grow in your faith and be transformed into the image and likeness of Christ. For other opportunities to connect with us, you can check out our website or look for us on social media. We love you all. Hope you join us again.